Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I'm sorry, I'm just not getting any reading.
Well, are you sure you're using that thing correctly?
There's not, I think so, but I'm sure there are no animals in there.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Chad Gross. Greetings, Chad. How are you today?
Doing well. I've had a busy week. Actually, school is getting ready to start, so I've been training and in training, not like combat training. Well, sometimes it feels like that, but basically sitting on Zoom or Google Meets for about 7.5 hours for 4 days in a row. So my brain is a little fried, but my classroom's set up, and we have another week of training, and then the kiddos come back.
Yeah, it'd be like, what do you call it? It'll be like Black Friday where they open up the doors and the kids just trample you and you break your arm the first day.
Exactly. And I'm like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop. Everybody together. Everybody together. And they're all running out of the building like wild animals. Yeah, that's me. I will tell you, though, I was hoping that the students weren't going to have to mask. It was like, and I was really hopeful. And unfortunately, we just got the confirmation this week that they are masking, which we all kind of knew was coming. But, there was that distant hope that it wasn't going to happen because, as I think I've mentioned before to you, listening to third graders, they already have a softer voice. And then you put a mask on them. And it makes it difficult, but we make it work. That's what teachers do. They take what they're given and they somehow make the magic happen. Your wife knows that.
Yes, indeed.
How about you? How are you?
Doing great. I subscribed to a few different YouTube channels, and this week I subscribed to one that I hadn't been subscribed to yet, although I'd seen it here and there. And that's David Wood's Acts 17 Apologetics. With all the stuff going on in Afghanistan and Islam and that sort of thing, his channel is really interesting right now with his commentary on certain things going on. Yeah, I like Acts 17 Apologetics and David Wood, and his content is fun to listen to.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've been on there.
Oh, I have. I will tell you a really quick story, and too bad we're not a video podcast yet or whatnot, because I was at a conference once where David Wood was speaking. And I had 3 different people walk up to me and address me as David Wood. They thought for sure that I had my hair spiked in the front. So I looked a little, it wasn't like it is right now. I actually had one lady come up and she said, you made this one point about the Quran. And I wanted to talk in the middle of what she was saying. I said, you're looking for him. And I pointed over at David Wood. She looked at David Wood. Then she looked at me. Then she looked back at David Wood. And you could tell she was just really confused. But he is much taller than me. I got to meet him and take a picture with him. And he got a kick out of the fact that, people thought he and I looked like brothers.
We have got to get these two together.
But he was very nice, very gracious, very humble, which a lot of people might not think that. But he just says what he thinks. He's fearless.
Very direct, to the point, and pulls no punches, man. And he doesn't care what people think, So anyway, if you're listening out there, you're looking for some interesting YouTube apologetics stuff, go to Acts 17 Apologetics on YouTube with David Wood. And I've also interviewed David in the past. So maybe it's a sign that we need to have him on the show. But we've got a great interview for you today, Dr. Phil Fernandes. And actually interviewed him thrice already.
Pulling out the KJV language.
Oh, yeah. Henceforth, hither and thither. It was back in 2010, 2012, 2013. Those were the years, the golden years of Apologetics 315.
Yes.
Back when we had the shovel underfoot, breaking new ground apologetically.
Hey, I will say real quick for listeners, check out Apologetics 315. They've did some changes on the website, and you're getting a daily post now. So you can check it daily for quotes and articles and podcasts and debates. Good stuff on there.
Go to it. It's kicking out the content, handpicked for you. Anyway, Dr. Phil Fernandes, he's a president of the Institute of Biblical Defense, which he founded in 1990, so he's been around doing apologetics longer than you have, to teach Christians how to defend the Christian faith. He's also a pastor, which is part of the reason we want to have him on, of Trinity Bible Fellowship in Silverdale, Washington. Teaches philosophy, world religions, theology, and apologetics for Crosspoint Academy and the Imago Dei Institute. So that's another Bible college.
I was just going to say that when I first started getting into apologetics on the internet, when I got saved, I was more looking at books, and I actually wasn't much of a techie person. And I started looking up apologetics articles, and I may have found Dr. Fernandes through your stuff, Brian, on Apologetics 315. And I found that he had arguments on the reliability of the New Testament and the Old Testament, and a number of articles online like that were really well written and concise. And they were super helpful to me. And I was actually looking for them last night on his website, and I couldn't find them anymore. So I don't know if they're housed somewhere else or if he took them down. But anyway, point being is his work has been helpful for me in the past, and I've watched a number of his debates and appreciate his graciousness in talking with his opponents. He debates both Christian and non-Christian opponents, and just, again, always helpful, always offers good challenges, but is, of course, open to being hearing the other side as well.
So let's get ready for the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Dr. Fernandes, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here talking with you, Brian. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've connected. It's been almost 10 years. So the first interview I did with you was back in 2010 for the podcast. Then 2012 and 13, we talked about like apologetics methodologies and apologetics and preaching, your books and resources and debates. So Chad and I are anxious to catch up with you about what's been going on in the past decade, and then pick your brain a bit about pastoring and apologetics and how apologetics affects that and vice versa. So tell us, our listeners, a bit about yourself for those who might not be familiar.
Okay, yeah, I planted a church, a small local church, a Trinity Bible Fellowship in 1988. I was doing a lot of studies for Liberty University and Columbia Evangelical Seminary, and then eventually moved on to Southern Evangelical Seminary and Veritas International University to basically study apologetics, to defend the faith. I found it was very difficult to share your faith with others if you're not going to try to respond to their objections. And so in 1990, I started the Institute of Biblical Defense, and we've trained, hundreds of lay people in apologetics and things of that sort. And so I've continued to pastor, but I also teach full-time apologetics and philosophy of religion and ethics at a Christian high school. So I kind of have two overlapping jobs. So it's been a little difficult to try to keep up with my scholarship and research. But I still do. Now that COVID's over, it looks like I'm going to do about 25 talks this year besides my pastoring. And I don't know how much out-of-state stuff I'm going to do anymore with just some of the health challenges that my family has had. But I'm just continuing to pastor, and whenever I exegete a passage, if it's something that goes against our culture, what our culture is teaching, I try to provide a defense of the biblical worldview. And so I think that I would not only argue that pastors should use apologetics. I think it's really to the point where if you don't, it's really hard to shepherd the flock. You've got to not only exhort your people in sound doctrine, but refute those who contradict. And so I think apologetics and pastoral ministry go hand in hand.
You haven't met Chad yet. He's been my sort of brother in arms when it comes to apologetics. Both of us have benefited from your resources and the content you've created, watching your debates and listen to your lectures and stuff like that.
Yeah, let me say this, and hello, Chad.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you.
A lot of I'm so grateful. Probably most of the stuff that people have listened to that I've done has been on your Apologetics 315. But for the past 20 years, I've been updating a lot of my stuff. So I'd recommend people go to Phil Fernandes, and that's Fernandes with an S. It's Portuguese, not Spanish. philfernandes.org. And if they go to philfernandes.org, right above my photo, you can just click on sermon audio, and then you click on sermons, and then you click on series, and you can get like courses and college level courses in ethics, philosophy of religion, intro to philosophy, worldviews, world religions, cults, taught on the college level, and audio and video. And usually it'll give the year that I've done it. So some of these lectures are 2017, 2018.
Oh, great.
My stuff has been a lot more updated over the years. So
that's great to hear. Great to hear.
Yes.
I know some of the stuff I had listened to back in the day, it seemed like, this has been ripped from an audio cassette, but they're great to hear that there's video and stuff like that.
Most of it was back.
Me and Chad were talking in our previous podcast. We heard this story and we wanted you to verify it or counter it or get your version of the story. Right. But the story was something about, Chad, do you want to recall that story?
Yeah, so I can't remember where I heard this. I don't know if it was a Stand to Reason podcast. I know it was somewhere, but essentially, and I might not have all the details correct, which is why we wanted to ask. So you followed, Greg Kokel did his kind of famous Columbo impression. And then he got up on stage and you were laughing or something. And no. Okay.
I thought I was being heckled. He didn't know me from the Man in the Moon, and he's Greg Kokel, so I knew who he was. He did his Columbo thing and everything, and so then he got done speaking, and so there was a little break. It was a conference of about 600 people in Bellevue, Washington, and I got up to speak, and I started speaking, and all of a sudden I heard some real loud laughing. And I thought, oh, no, I got a heckler, And I figured, maybe he'll go away. Well, 20, 30 seconds went by, and they're still laughing. It's just one guy out of 600. So I glanced over and to see who it was, and I was like, it's Greg Kokel. So I didn't know what was going on. He was like laughing, and he had his forearm on the pew, and he was sitting in the front row, and he's looking back at the guy behind him, nodding, like, hey, this guy's pretty good. But it took him a couple minutes to figure out that I wasn't. He had just done his Columbo impersonation, so he thought I was doing Columbo.
Oh, okay.
And then he felt so guilty that that he was laughing at the way I talk. I'm from Essex County, New Jersey, and I grew up with the Italians. So he felt so guilty about it that he had to really. I gave my lecture on the cumulative case for God, and. But I don't know if it was because of some of his subconscious guilt or whatever, but he ended up taking a statement that I made and referenced it in his tactics book and then footnoted me. And said, I got this from Christian apologist Phil Fernandes and stuff. So he threw me a little scrap from the table there, and I appreciate that. But there was another time a few years later, he was doing a Columbo impersonation at Southern Evangelical Seminary for, I think, Frank Turek's cross-examination thing. And I found out. So I kind of cut a little bit of my Southern Evangelical Seminary class that I was attending. And he didn't know I was there. And I sat in the third row. And as he was doing Columbo, he said, by the way, I'm just faking this. He said, but there's a guy in the Pacific Northwest up in Washington, and he's the real deal. And you probably never heard of him, but his name is, Phil Fernandes. And the whole audience at Southern Evangelical Seminary, they know who I am. So everybody was looking at me. I was not more than 15 feet away from him. He had no idea I was there. So yeah, that's my Greg Kokel story. But every time he sees me, he gives me a big hug, and he says, I'm so glad you're doing apologetics in the Pacific Northwest. Now, I don't know if that means it's great to know that or, better you than me, region or whatever. But no, Greg Kokel's he's a good guy. He kids around a lot with me. He's a good guy. So now Josh McDowell, on the other hand, he keeps trying to. Oh man, Douglas Guyvit was really embarrassed for Josh, but Josh thinks he needs to teach me how to talk. He's convinced I'm going to get throat cancer, if I keep talking like this. He's trying to get me to talk from the diaphragm more, and it's getting kind of embarrassing because I'm going to see him next month, and I'm hoping he doesn't give me his medical advice again. And,
are you serious? Like he really does think?
Yeah, he thinks because I talk. It's like, look, man, hey, I'm not. It's not like my dad talked the same way. My mother probably talked the female version of this, but but it's really interesting how different guys talk. And let me give you a Gary Habermas story though. He denies it, but I told one of his other students Alex McFarland, when I told him, he started laughing so hard, no sound coming out of his mouth. It was in a Barnes and Noble in North Carolina, that he slowly dropped to one knee. Then he dropped down to the floor, got in the fetal position, and was laughing without words. So, but with Gary Habermas, because he's friends with both of us and our former professor. He has a Detroit accent, but it only comes out when he's tired.
Oh.
And so I called him up. This was back in the mid-'90s. I hadn't talked to him in years, and I felt bad for it. And so I wanted to get caught up. And I said, "Hey, Doc, how you doing?" He said, "Oh, I'm doing pretty good." And I said, "Hey, I got your latest book." Figure make small talk. And I said, "Hey, I got your latest book." And he said, "Oh, The Stroke of Jesus." And I'm thinking, like, the stroke of Jesus? What in the world? What did he have, a nervous breakdown or something? So I said, no, that sounds like a good one. I'm thinking, what in the world, the stroke of Jesus? He said, "Well, what'd you get?" And I said, "I got the historical Jesus." And he said, "Yeah, that's what I said, the stroke of Jesus." And so he denies it, but I told Alex McFarland, and he just died laughing, because he knows when Gary gets tired, he stops moving his lips, and the old Detroit accent comes out. So, but yeah, the interesting thing about these guys, J.P. Moreland hadn't seen him in 20 years, and I thought, gee, is this guy even going to remember me? And we were speaking at a conference in Shelton right before November 2019, right before COVID hit, and he just walked up to me and he said, "Dr. Fernandes, I'm so proud of you," and he just gave me a big hug, gave me a kiss on the cheek. And he started weeping. So, I mean, some of these thinkers, we think of them as like rational machines, but they're real, breathing human beings. They're Christians. They're Christians first, and they're apologists second. And it just, you get, like, a lot of people thought Norman Geisler was really gruff, because he breaks out the sledgehammer at the drop of a hat sometimes, but getting to know him, he would just, you'd be eating dinner next to him after speaking at a conference, and he just put his arm around you and just pat you on the back, and you could tell he was praying for you, So, so there's a lot of guys that, sometimes you're not sure the guy's speaking the truth in love, but believe me, these apologists that have dedicated their lives to the Lord and stuff like that, the ones that I've met and grown to know over the years, are the real deal. They genuinely, Lee Strobel, they genuinely love the Lord, and it's just a blessing. A Douglas Guyvett, just these guys, you just see them, you just want to hug them. So,
well, that's great to hear. Especially, there's so much talk nowadays about Christian singers and Christian thinkers who are either leaving the faith or who morally fall or whatnot. And so that, hopefully that's encouraging. I know it is for us, but also for our audience, that there are people out there who are speaking it and live, but also living it. And so thanks so much for sharing those stories.
Yeah, and it's just throwing one more thing too. With Dr. Geisler, I was looking at him in between talks a couple of years before he died, and how tired he was getting, and would always say he wouldn't fly out to the West Coast, but for his buddies, he'd fly out to the West Coast and speak. I really think he probably could have lived an extra 5 years if he would have just cut back on his speaking schedule. But there's guys and gals out there that are dying for the faith without even being persecuted. They've got this work ethic and this passion to preach and defend the faith, and that doesn't always go noticed. A lot of times you get a big name speaker, and it's like, hey, I did it to Gary Habermas once. We want you to give 12 lectures in 2 days.
Shoo.
And horribly underpaid too. And so these guys they always look tired because they're taking time sometimes away from their family, taking time from their sleep. But it's just great to for the past 30 years to be around these godly Christian guys, godly defenders of the faith. But there's a lot of sacrifice in there to keep the level of scholarship that they have too. That's ours all. Nobody's applauding you or saying amen when you're alone in the study, research and stuff. But the quality of what these guys are doing is just off the charts. So,
are there any particular things apologetically that are on your radar or that you want to point people to?
Yeah. I think, obviously with apologetics, you're going to be defending absolute truth, God's existence, deity of Christ, salvation through Jesus, New Testament reliability, things of that sort. If you want a robust evangelical defense, you've got to also, defend inerrancy. Some of us are called just to defend mere Christianity, others a robust evangelicalism, which would include biblical inerrancy. You got to deal with the problem of evil and miracles. But what I'm seeing more and more is the need for what I call cultural apologetics. If we were living in Germany as the Nazis took over, a lot of the Nazis would have agreed with us that God exists, and they would have paid lip service to some of the Christian doctrines found in the creeds. But we would be wrong to ignore the movement, the cultural aspects of National Socialism. And so I would like to see more Christian apologists. You do what you feel led, but I would like to see more Christian apologists handle things like critical race theory. I know Vodi Bakum wrote an outstanding book, Fault Lines. Owen Strachan, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, got a good book on the topic. Neil Shendy's doing a lot of good research. But we really need to, right now, I think the spirit of the age right now is the deification of the state, where we traditionally look to God, and then our families and our churches. And now it seems like every problem we go right to the state. And so I would like to see more Christian apologists address, what I call what C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man, what Schaeffer called the death of man, what I refer to as the deification of the state. It was 1998 when I presented a paper at Multnomah for the regional meeting of the Evangelical Theological Society. I caught some flack from Stanley Grenz. We butt heads on that. But it was the coming death of Western civilization. Now I'm getting a bunch of phone calls from pastors who called me a nut back then, telling me, hey, you were right, and it's like, okay, well, if we end up sharing a prison cell someday for preaching the gospel with somebody, it would be nice if they would be thanking us for warning them about what was coming down. And so, yes, we need, defense of the essential doctrines of the Christian faith, but we also need to look at some of the cultural aspects that if our society continues to abandon God, that is going to have horrible, horrible consequences, not only for America, but for the world. And in fact, I think that's why the last president caught so much flack. I mean, yeah, the guy was a jerk, but I think that's one of the qualifications to be a politician. You got to be a jerk. I think that the big issue was the guy was standing for American sovereignty, and right now globalism is the way to go. So I would just like to see a little bit more of that, and then we also need to look into paranormal apologetics, because there's an awful lot of people that have questions that we apologists are not answering. Questions like they think their house is haunted, what's going on, and they feel like oppressed beyond the physical description. Even Bigfoot sightings, UFO phenomenon. I just think we just need more scholarly research. There are a lot of Christians who are doing that research, but they don't always bring with them the scholarship that would make for a very good, robust defense. And by the way, guys like the late Walter Martin, Dr. Norman Geisler in the 1980s, they had a full-blown Christian response to the whole UFO phenomenon. So I think we just need to see more of the paranormal apologetics responding to the apparitions of Mary and the stigmata. What is that? What is really going on? Is this from God, or is it man-made, or is it coming from the other side? So I think we need more research in that, because those are the kinds of questions people are asking. God's built a hedge of protection around America because of the faith of our forefathers, but as we abandon God, that we're losing that protection. And as we lose that protection, we're going to see more and more demonic paranormal activity. And if we Christians just tell people, don't worry about it, you just had too much pepperoni pizza last night, don't worry about it. If we respond just the way the atheists do, we're going to be considered, Christianity will be considered as outdated as atheism, as antiquated as atheism, when more of this stuff comes down. But But I tell you, you reject God, you open the doors. Missionaries have been telling us for generations now that when they go to third world countries, tribal peoples to preach the gospel, apologetics for them has more to do with power encounters than it does with rational debate. So I'm not saying let's do paranormal apologetics instead of traditional apologetics, but I'm saying let's do both, and let's look at cultural apologetics. There's even a lot of non-Christian thinkers like Jordan Peterson and David Horowitz. There's a lot of non-Christian thinkers that are actually arguing that we should not throw Christianity under the bus because of the horrible consequences that will come to Western civilization. Mm-hmm. And so I think it'd be nice if more Christian apologists got involved with that as well.
So Dr. Fernandes, I was curious as you were talking there, I was thinking you've been a pastor and a teacher, professor for so long. Is that one way you've seen the types of questions that people are asking kind of change, where it used to be more questions of how can we know God exists? How can we know the Bible's reliable? How can we know that Jesus rose from the dead? The questions are starting to shift a little bit, maybe to those cultural apologetics issues and some of those paranormal issues. Would that be a fair thing to say, or is it both and?
Well, in the church, yes. The danger is in the academic circles, students want to be like their professors. So they don't want to ask crazy questions and stuff like that. So I'm still getting more your basic apologetic type stuff. But it just watch televisions, surf the internet, and you'll see what kinds of questions that they're asking. I do know now, and I've been a little disconnected from the secular campuses because of my teaching at the high school, but in 2001, when I debated Elliot Ratzman at Princeton, what I realized there was that by 2001 at Ivy League schools, the question, the complaint against Christianity was no longer, is Christianity true? Princeton could care less about truth. The question was, is Christianity tolerant? So the new God was tolerance, politically correct tolerance. And so I found that very interesting. Josh McDowell was onto that in the late 1990s. He was seeing that this new tolerance, traditional tolerance, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. I love you and I will treat you like a human being even if you disagree with me. The new tolerance, all beliefs are equally true. All behaviors equally wholesome. Oh, by the way, if you disagree with me, I can't tolerate you. And so now that new tolerance has shifted into, this critical theory, a neo-Marxist type of view coming out of like the Frankfurt School, and is now probably most evident in critical race theory. I think if I had continued to do more work on secular campuses, I probably would be able to gauge the pulse a little bit better. But just from my quote unquote, lay people, regular people that come to church, I see that these are the questions their friends are asking them, and from people that I dialogue with. And like if you use Greg Kokel's tactics, you could start a relationship with a person and say, hey, so what are your views on UFOs? And then you just keep asking, well, how do you know that's true? Why do you believe that? But it's amazing. But a lot of times you ask people, well, what's your view about God? And they might or might not give a response. Some of them would just right away just say, hey, I don't talk religion. And they don't even realize they have their own religion. But whatever the case, it's and I argued as far back as I think 1987, even before I was a pastor, that secular America was already going New Age. I didn't at that time fully see that one of the bridges from secularism to New Age was postmodern thought. But I think we need to recognize that we're seeing the return of the ancient gods, the ancient pagan gods. Neo-paganism is on the rise, and we've got to, rather than act like, well, no, I only talk all this, intellectual, rational stuff that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates talked about, but it's like, look, if people are asking these questions, why not do the research and give them a biblical response to it? So.
You're up in Washington. I wonder if you're familiar with Antioch Bible Church, Pastor Karl Payne there. Recently, me and Chad have been reading his book, Spiritual Warfare. Would you be familiar with him?
Karl's like my brother of another mother. He No, he's a big, and we look kind of goofy because I stand about 5'5". Karl is a big man, so when we were flying out to Minnesota to speak at Jason Carlson's church out there, he took his sneakers off, and I realized that I thought, you know what? I think my foot with my sneaker on could fit inside his, and it did. So he's a big man. He was a chaplain for the Seahawks for years, and I don't think any of them would have messed with him. Gentle giant. I wouldn't want to get on his wrong side, but no, he's pretty much an expert on counseling people that are being spiritually, demonically depressed and oppressed and things of that sort. The one thing the one area where I'm not sure I agree with him on is that I have encountered more of the little glimpses of it, but the foaming at the mouth, speaking in a different voice, levitation of objects. I've researched that type of thing, and he seems to think that a lot of that type of stuff isn't really going on, but I see more and more of it going on. And I always I do an investigation and search for the open door. If it's a household that's being affected, I want to find out who's behind it. And I interview a lot of witnesses, and I make sure they're reliable witnesses. But and so I would recommend reading Karl Payne's book. I think that's a must read for any Christians who want to do spiritual battle. But I just think we need solid Christian thinkers investigating these. Gary Habermas and J.P. Moreland, their works on near-death experiences, though that's an example of what I'm talking about. And by the way, if you listen to my lectures and stuff, I'm like 95% your traditional apologist kind of guy. But I'm saying that we got to also deal with this other stuff. And this other stuff is radical. And if we Christians don't give a biblical response, the only game in town is going to be neo-paganism. So there is major interest in that.
Yeah. Recently, Billy Hallowell, too, came out with a popular level book called Playing with Fire, A Modern Investigation into Demons, Exorcism, and Ghosts. And he actually has written just from the perspective of a journalist, because that's his job. And he looks into it, and Josh McDowell's had him on his podcast. And so some interesting stuff there. So that would be another book kind of more on a popular level that people might find helpful, too.
Yeah, and he sounds like an old school journalist like Lee Strobel, where you actually research and investigate and try to find the truth. And so yeah, if it's a legitimate journalist, that's a good. In fact, was it Frank Morrison who moved the stone? Yes. He was a journalist that tried to investigate to disprove the resurrection, and he couldn't figure out who moved the stone. And next thing you know, he's a Bible-believing Christian. Yeah. So.
I want to shift gears, and one of the things we really wanted to hit during the interview was apologetics when it comes to being a pastor. And we had actually an email from a listener saying, hey, we'd love to have Phil Fernandes on your show to talk about how apologetics, informs his pastoring, and pastoring informs your apologetics. Maybe you can just take that and run with it.
Yeah, well, it's, a pastor is a shepherd. And a shepherd has to protect his sheep. You have to feed the sheep. And that's when we're giving them the good, solid biblical truth. But we also have to protect them from the wolves. And a lot of these wolves come in sheep's clothing. And I'm kind of glad the wolves come in sheep's clothing because, if nobody was faking it, you wouldn't. It's good job security for pastors that we have to show that what looks like a sheep is often a wolf. And I've been studying this for decades, and here's why. But it's one of those deals. I think if the pastor is an apologist, as you study the text and you're aware of the way the coworkers of your flock think, your community, how they think, then I think if you're an apologist and you're a pastor, and when you're studying the text, you start asking Gray Cokel kind of questions. Well, how do we know this is true? And, things of that sort. Now, of course, if you're teaching that the Bible is the word of God without error, then we know it's true. But if we care enough for our people and we realize their friends aren't going to accept that answer, are there some reasons that we can give for it? So you're not going to see that in every sermon that I preach, but I will, like this Sunday, I'm going to start on Ephesians 5:22, the passage dealing with the relationship between the wife and the husband and their responsibilities and things of that sort. And I'm going to mention what's going on in the culture. and what the view of marriage is in the world. And obviously, I'm exegeting a passage, so I'm not going to have time. Although my sermons are about an hour and 5 minutes long, so I have more time than most pastors. I'm not going to be able to address every issue, but I'm going to show them that this is very culturally relevant. Don't mistake me. I'm any pastor or church that's trying to make God relevant. I don't know what God they're talking about. God is omnirelevant because he's God. So I'm not trying to make God relevant. I'm just showing that he is, and his word is relevant. And there might be some apologetic responses that I give from the pulpit. At the same time, my assistant pastors are all trained in apologetics, and they train people in apologetics at men's Bible study, ladies' Bible studies, and things of that sort. So it's just recognizing that if we're going to make disciples, we not only have to teach people sound doctrine, but we've got to refute those who contradict, and we have to give every man an answer. So passages like Colossians 4 verses 5 and 6, 1 Peter 3:15, Apologetics 3:15, named after that, Titus 1:9, Jude 3. And so I just think it's part of our job right now. Now, Jonathan Edwards did that a lot in his day, yet it wasn't needed as much because, virtually everybody was a professing Christian, but he still thought it was essential to do that type of thing. But I think even more so now that we're living in what Francis Schaeffer called the post-Christian era, what Friedrich Nietzsche, the German atheist, called the death of God. And so we're living in a culture that you can no longer, just because you say something comes from the Bible, that doesn't automatically mean that people are going to agree with you. And so when I preach from the pulpit, just in case we get visitors every Sunday, there might be a visitor who needs some evidence to believe in what it is I'm preaching. At the same time, even our people, they're dealing with friends. There's peer pressure out there. They're dealing with friends they're trying to witness to. And so I try to look at it from the perspective, well, how do I know that's true? Now, maybe the reason why I got an apologetics in my background, I was raised in Roman Catholicism, but never really believed. Kind of walked away and was agnostic, or at least skeptical of God's existence. And then I started searching for meaning while I was in the Marine Corps and came to Christ. And it was at a Catholic charismatic prayer meeting that I came to Christ. And a lady there asked me, because she had just come to Christ, are we really supposed to believe in the virgin birth? Was Jesus really born a virgin? I was like, wait a minute, the Catholic Church taught me a lot of things that now I don't think are biblical. And our Catholic friends would disagree with us on that. Gee, what about the virgin birth? So I had to do some digging in the scriptures, and not being, that biblically knowledgeable, I ended up having to find it in Isaiah 7:14 before I even found it in Matthew and Luke. But whatever the case, coming at it with a skeptical approach, well, I'm not just going to accept what I'm taught anymore. When people tell me stuff, I'm going to research it and decide. An example of that, I think, would be like the vaccines. And I'm not really concerned with whether people are pro-vaccines or anti-vaccines. But I want to know they're not going to just take it just because Anthony Fauci said to take it. I want to know that, hey, look into it. This isn't the so-called dark ages. You can go online, you can research the thing, and you make the decision based on the data that you see. So I think that we should have that, the Show Me State, that Missouri or whatever. We ought to have that attitude where, hey, if I'm going to teach people to believe something, I'm also going to tell them why it's true. And so we just come at it with it's more of a mindset, I think, than anything. And then just be prepared to answer objections if they come after the service. If the guy comes up to you and says, no, I can't believe that God is three persons, that doesn't make sense, or whatever. And, are we capable of giving a defense of the Trinity? I think more work needs to be done in apologetics on getting back to on the incarnation of Athanasius, Why the God-Man by Anselm. I think that's one of the most powerful things when you compare Christianity with the world's religions. Christianity shows that all sin is rebellion against the ultimately worthy being, i.e. God. Therefore, all sin makes us deserving of the ultimate punishment, which the Bible calls Gehenna, or the lake of fire. So if there's going to be a substitute sacrifice, the substitute sacrifice has to be ultimately worthy to cover that rebellion against an ultimately worthy being. So the substitute sacrifice has to be God. But God as God can't die. So God had to become a man. God the Son had to become a man to represent man, but to also to be sacrificed, to die for us. And so that's why Paul talks about Christ's death demonstrates, Romans 3, God's justice. But then in Romans 5:8, it also demonstrates God's love. How much did God love us? He loved us so much, he had his Son slaughtered, sacrificed in our place. How just is God? God is so just, he cannot allow Phil, Brian, or Chad, or anybody into heaven unless our sin has been paid for in full. So it wasn't like God just arbitrarily chose, I'll send my Son to die for them. It was like there was no other way for God to remain just and to be able to justify an unjust person like me or you. And so sometimes I think, as we defend mere Christianity, God's existence and the bodily resurrection, New Testament reliability, I think there's also a powerful argument for that the God of Christianity is more just than any other God. He is so just that he could not forgive us unless our sins were paid for in full. And he's so loving, he was willing to sacrifice his Son as the ultimately worthy Lamb of God who died on the cross to take away our sins.
Well put. Dr. Fernandes, I don't know what it's like out there in Washington, but I can tell you that here on the East Coast, I've known a number of different pastors, and many don't see the necessity of apologetics. Many don't incorporate it into their sermons. I think this is a fatal mistake, especially nowadays when, as you rightly said, not everybody believes the Bible they're preaching from. What would be your encouragement to them? Or, imagine you're sitting around a table after church with a group of pastors, and you've got some that kind of don't see the value in it. What is it you'd say to them to encourage them to begin to give a defense?
Yeah, I would probably just give an example from my experience, just to show how needed it is. I had a student. He and his brother were going to a youth group, and one of the kids going to the youth group ended up committing suicide.
Oh, my.
And it devastated the two brothers. One, it caused them to cling closer to Jesus. The other one, it pushed them away from the Lord. So through apologetics, I got him to rationally acknowledge that God must exist, a personal God. And then as time went on, the Lord was helping me and others to lead him in the direction. And so he was beginning to profess faith in Christ once again, but he was still questioning things because of all the hurts. And so eventually it reached a point where his pastor didn't want to baptize him. He was professing faith in Christ because he was asking too many questions. And in philosophy course, I taught him about the law of non-contradiction. A cannot equal non-A at the same time in the same way. And so he asked his pastor, he thought, well, that makes sense. But then how can Jesus be both infinite and finite? How could he be both God and man in the same way at the same time? That doesn't make sense. And so he confronted his pastor on it, and his pastor kind of chastised him just for asking the question. And so he came to school that next Monday, and he was devastated. He said, I'm through with Christianity. And I had to calm him down. And I wanted to make sure he was calm, too. He's a big 300-pound guy who could throw down, And I got him all calmed down and everything. And then it was in weights class. I had him in my weights class, too. He told me that. And I looked at him. I said, his name is Cameron. I said, Cameron, don't you remember in 9th grade Bible a few years ago? The hypostatic union. Jesus is one person with two distinct natures forever. He always existed as God, the second person of the Trinity, but at a point in time, he added a finite human nature. So Jesus is both infinite and finite in that he is infinite in his divine nature, but he also has, without taking from his infinite divine nature, he has a finite human nature. So there's no, the law of non-contradiction, A cannot equal non-A at the same time in the same way. This is saying Jesus is both infinite and finite at the same time, but in different ways, in different senses. He has two distinct natures. And so that's an example where just good, solid theology 101 training would have helped that pastor. Now, I told a retired chaplain who was teaching math at our school, retired Navy chaplain, that story, and he got upset. He was like freaking out. And he said, they call me Doc, and he said, Doc, I'm not sure I would have known the answer, but I would have told, if he was my parishioner, I would have told him, let's look into it. I'm sure there's an answer to this. Then I would have remembered the hypostatic union explains that. So, but there's an example where we got to stop telling our people, God wants us to love him with all our minds, not just our hearts, souls, and strength, but with our minds as well. God doesn't mind us asking questions as long as we're really looking for the answers. And so I think our pastors, we're and then if our kids go off to college, but now they'll get critical race theory in the second grade now. But if they go off to college, they're getting hit with all this stuff, and we're just going to tell them, just believe. And then they go to college, and the professor says, yeah, your pastor, your church, those Christians they're a bunch of non-thinking ignoramuses. So somewhere along the line, the church in America thought it was cool to stop thinking and just have Kierkegaardian blind faith. Well, the atheists never got the memo. They kept right on thinking, and now they're devastating our kids. And I'll tell you, the new atheism is dead now.
Yes.
Critical race theory is the new religion. Neo-Marxism is the new religion. Cultural Marxism, atheism is dead. And by the way, we're going to have a lot of open doors with atheists, because there's agnostics out there, especially ones that are libertarian in their politics, that are saying the only people that agree with them anymore are Christians. And they used to think Christians were non-thinkers, and now so many politically correct people canceling them. So people like, even a guy like Stefan Molyneux, who says that cancel culture is a dress rehearsal for genocide. You can cancel people and destroy their careers and their futures. That's only a few steps away from Auschwitz. But whatever the case, we're now starting to find Jordan Peterson has great respect now for Christians. He's just got to make that he's reading C.S. Lewis right now. He's just got to understand that these myths that teach eternal truths, what if C.S. Lewis is right? And if the incarnation, God the Son becoming a man, and Jordan Peterson cries when he talks about that. He says, I just can't, if that comes together, it changes everything. And then he talks about Christians that he knows where Jesus hasn't changed everything, so how could it be true? And so he just needs to, it's like C.S. Lewis said, the best argument for Christianity is Christians. The best argument against Christianity is Christians. It just depends which Christians you're talking to. So pray that Jordan Peterson starts talking to the right Christians. He has talked to Gary Habermas and William Lane Craig, by the way, on the issue of the resurrection, and he acknowledges that he's not fully convinced it didn't happen.
Wow.
Yeah. There's an open door there. We're going to have an open door with Muslims as political correct, transgender, gay rights type issues. It's not only Christians that aren't going to sign on, but there's going to be Muslims that aren't going to sign on to that. Many atheists aren't postmodern, so there's going to be an open door to a whole new crowd. People we've been debating might end up being the most open to the gospel in the near future. So, but yeah, somehow the world never got the memo to stop thinking, and our churches did. We're paying the dues on that. So.
Well, I like how you defined being a pastor, too. You said that they both feed and protect their sheep. And one of the way they protect their sheep is by, showing them philosophies and ideas that are kind of those wolves in sheep's clothing. And I think your example was a beautiful way of demonstrating that apologetics does have a clear pastoral purpose. And so that was helpful. So thank you.
Yeah, let me say this, too. I'm not a Greek and Hebrew scholar. Some pastors are. So every pastor usually has something besides his pastoral skills and his knowledge of the Bible that he can bring something to the table. So I would say if you're a pastor out there and you don't feel led to study apologetic issues deeply, I don't care how small your church is, there probably is somebody who is, some mature Christian. And I would say work with a guy. And I would say this, though, if some apologetics layperson in your church, or maybe he's not even a layperson, maybe the guy's got a Master of Arts in Apologetics or a PhD in Philosophy of Religion, if you ask him questions before preaching a sermon on the resurrection, please give him credit. I've had about a dozen phone calls and email messages from guys who get so frustrated because their pastor calls them in for an hour-long discussion, takes notes, and then preaches a sermon 2 days later and acts like he's this brilliant dude who knew this stuff all along. So at least give credit where credit is due. And don't pretend to be something you're not. I never pretend to be a Greek and Hebrew scholar. I acknowledge to my people, I know just enough Greek to be dangerous. So I've got to refer, if I say something about the Greek or the Hebrew, I got to refer to Greek and Hebrew scholars. And if you're not an apologist, if that's not your strength, fine. But you could start reading the works. They're out there. You could watch the lectures. You can go to Apologetics 315 and get a pretty solid apologetics education. But if you don't feel led to do that, find somebody in your church who does feel led and then refer to them. And if somebody's got a question, you can't answer it, say, I don't know the answer to that question, but you need to talk to Joe Schmo. He studies this stuff all the time. And if Joe Schmo studies this stuff all the time, if he doesn't have the answer, don't bluff. But you can say, hey, I don't know the answer, but I study this stuff all the time. Let's me and you look into this. We'll research it together.
Yeah, that's good stuff. We've talked about how long you've been doing apologetics and how you've got students, you've got your congregation. You've been seeing the apologetics landscape for enough time to see it change and the questions change and the approaches and the needs out there change. But you've probably also seen various ways on how things are done wrong or made plenty of mistakes yourself. So my question is, if you're giving advice to younger apologists these days, what do you think would be some of the hard-earned lessons that you'd want to be sure to pass on?
I think one thing is, before engaging in philosophical discussion, make sure that's the topic at hand. So if somebody's talking, I had one guy in one of my classes, and he just blurted out right in the middle of the class, well, how could God exist if there's evil and human suffering? And so we entered into this 20, 30-minute philosophical discussion on the problem of evil, and it didn't even come close to answering his question to his satisfaction. The next day, he had no problem with Christianity. Maybe 2 weeks later, all of a sudden, the problem of evil is a big problem again. So I had to do some digging and found out the guy's dad slowly died of cancer and died when he was like 5 or 6 years old. So he was not asking a philosophical question.
Mm-hmm.
He's just saying, how you want me to believe in God, that God is a good father? How come he let my father die?
Wow.
And so every once in a while, we gotta get off our high horses. We got to differentiate between the people who need a hug and a friend, and they just want to vent, and the people who are really looking for a philosophical discussion, a philosophical answer. Another thing is that some people like to ask $1 million questions, but they don't want $1 million answers. They want a 5-cent answer. So they get a glazed over look when you're in. I mean, I just pray for them. I don't know what you can do to help them. But whatever the case, also on college campuses, man, I tell you, sometimes you got to choose between winning a debate and planting seed with the crowd. You really try to check the nonverbal communication of your audience, because there might be a red herring, a tangent, that if you go off on that tangent, it takes away from your time. You know, be aware of your audience and just be there to plant seed. Also in debates, I would say look out for question bombing. Jeffrey J. Lauder, he taught Eddie Tabash and Dan Barker how to do that. For every minute it takes to ask a question, it might take 10 minutes to give a good response. So if you just ask more questions than your opponent has time to answer, you could really put them on the ropes. So the best you can do is to group the questions together and take like 20 objections and narrow it down to the 3 questions that are really being asked. and then also refer people to works on Bible difficulties or whatever it may be. Like when I debated Eddie Tabash, he quoted from one of my works. It was "Does God Exist?" It was at Washington State University, and he quoted from one of my books showing that I was a young earther. Now, I'm not going to defend the young earth position at Wazoo, okay? That's an intramural debate between Christians. So what I said was, look, I acknowledge I'm a young earther, but most of my colleagues are old earth. But Eddie, keep in mind, this debate is, does God exist? If it's old earth creationism, I win. If it's young earth creationism, I win. If it's theistic evolution, I win. Heck, if it's Hinduism, I win. So, Eddie, I'd like to see you rejoin me in this debate. He also brought up Bible contradictions. I was like, Eddie, this debate is not about did God write a book or did God write 66 books? It's does God exist? Now, and then I gave a quick Augustinian response to supposed Bible contradictions, referred people to Geisler's work and Gleason Archer's work on that, and then moved on. So you got to watch out about the question bombing and the red herrings that they turn. And, you know, but remind the audience that this guy needs to return to the debate. Now, I really connected with that audience at Wazoo, but let me just throw in this real quick. The moderator was one of their philosophy professors, really polite, fair gentleman. And at the end of the debate, he said, you did really well. And I said, yeah, so did Eddie. It's Eddie Tabash, a lawyer who worked for the Clinton administration. But he said, yeah. He said, you did really well. I said, yeah, so did Eddie. And he looked at me, he shook his head and said, no, you did really well. So he knew Eddie was shooting the baloney during the debate, and he's a philosophy professor. So I asked him, I said, well, are you a Christian? He said, no, I'm an agnostic. However, my wife is a traditional Catholic, and out of respect for her faith, I attend Mass with her on Sundays. And then he said, I got to make a confession. I'm starting to enjoy it. And so that's the kind of philosophy professor I'd like to study under. He's a soft agnostic. He's saying, look, I haven't seen enough evidence to believe that God exists, but maybe you have. You might be right. I might be wrong. But it's really interesting. But that's the kind of impact you want to have. Students after that debate came up with these two guys. I had a long line that I was talking to, and two students was like, man, I love when you said this, and I love when you said that. And I said, so you guys are Christians? And they said, no, I think we're kind of agnostic. But then I love when you did this. I love when you do this. So sometimes that's all you can do is just plant a little bit of seed. I was going to give up debating on college campuses, but Campus Crusade for Christ leader told me, he said, look, don't, because they're only hearing one side. If a Christian comes in to speak, only Christians attend. If it's a debate, a lot of non-believers show up because they want to see, the Christians spill some blood there. But this, for some of them, this is the only time they're going to hear a Christian scholar present and defend the Christian worldview. But I tell you, if you want to be Mr. Popular, don't take debates nowadays. And our students in college campuses, they're no longer capable, a lot of them, of original thinking or critical thought. So you can refute an argument, and you look and you can just tell it just went over everybody's head. Now, there's exceptions. If a guy's going for an engineering degree, they can't give him all these gender studies and politically correct courses. They got to actually teach him a lot of math and a lot of truth. But it is getting more difficult when that audience can't handle the truth. So sometimes, now I'll say this too, no one has to accept the messenger to accept the message. So if they don't like you, all you care about is that they accept the message. However, we need to keep in mind, people are much more likely to accept our message if they first like the messenger. So I don't live to be liked, but if atheists tell me after the debate's over, man, I really like that guy, that's, when an atheist says, man, all those Christians are stupid and I hate them, except that one guy. That one guy, Fernandes, I like the way he talks. I like his jokes. Is that the best rational debate strategy? No, but these postmodern times, people care more about your story and care more about their feelings. And if you can give them good vibes, they'll listen to you all day long, even if they disagree with you. And since God's word doesn't return void, it's worth it if you get a listen. So.
Dr. Fernandes, you mentioned question bombing. I had not heard that phrase before. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, question bombing. I found out about it the hard way, debating Jeffrey J. Louder. And after the debate, I said, man, you're asking a lot of questions and this and that. He said, yeah, technically it's called question bombing, and it's really, not the most ethical approach. But because debates are about time management, if you ask more questions than your opponent has time to answer, it puts him on the ropes the whole debate. And I said, well, how was I supposed to respond to it? He looked at me and said, just what you did. You grouped together the similar questions and you answered a group of questions. And I'm telling you, if you take debates, you better master the sound bites.
Right.
So like William Lane Craig told the guy said, I watched several of your debates. I don't think you're that great of a scholar. And Craig told him, do not judge my scholarship based on my debates. Debates are all about time management. You want to judge my scholarship? Look at the 60-page peer-reviewed papers that I write. Then you tell me if I'm a scholar or not. Not all brilliant. Okay, I'm not a presuppositionalist, but Cornelius Van Til was a brilliant thinker, but he was a horrible communicator. If John Frame and Greg Monson didn't explain what their professor, Cornelius Van Til, was teaching, most of us would have just assumed he was a babbler. Because, this guy equivocated all over the place. So just because a guy's brilliant doesn't mean he's a great communicator. And you need a little bit of Rush Limbaugh or Donald Trump in debates. Now, I'm not saying the name calling, but you got to master the soundbite. Frederick Douglass was a good example of that. He, from the black preaching of slavery days, he would take his main idea and really say it poetically. And he would speak for like 6 hours at a time. And every half hour, he would repeat his main point. Now, he knew nobody was going to remember all 6 hours of what he said, but he thought, I gave him 12 times my main point, and it was so poetic. For me, my God's bigger than your God. When I'm talking about false religions, are they going to remember the passage from Isaiah? Or are they going to remember, my God's bigger than your God? There is a God, and you're not him. Okay? And then I could put meat on that skeleton. That's just good preaching. I could put meat on that skeleton, but you got to have those cliches that people will remember for the rest of their lives. And then when they get into discussion about it, they might even remember some of the things you talked about, not word for word. And so good preaching it's kind of like we're talking about being a pastor, being an apologist, but being a good preacher can make you a better debater, and being a good debater can make you a better preacher.
Well, that's great stuff. You've shared a lot of insights today. We're really grateful for it. And unfortunately, we've also filled up the time, so we're going to wrap it up at the moment. But before we go, you mentioned your website, philfernandez with an S.org. Are there any other resources you want to point people to, or a book or two that you think would be helpful?
Yeah, probably my book, The Atheist Delusion, A Christian Response to Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. Also, my Hijacking Historical Jesus. Unlike most apologists who tap into New Testament criticism, I actually go back to more traditional arguments that predate historical criticism's impact. And I think we've got a lot more arguments. Some of our favorite apologists, when they're asked, they say, well, we don't have any eyewitness testimony from any eyewitness who saw Jesus risen from the dead. And a lot of our favorite apologists will say, we have Paul. Well, I think we need to go back to saying we have Paul, we have Matthew, Mark probably saw the risen Christ, John saw the risen Christ, we have James, we have Peter, and I think we can argue for the traditional authorship. And by the way, one of my former high school students who's now working on a PhD debated Michael Shermer. I role-played, it was about miracles, I role-played Shermer and demolished him. And then me and his father counseled him on what he needed to change. But one of the changes I told was stick to the traditional authorship and the earlier dates of the Gospels and this and that. And he did, and Shermer didn't know what to do with it. Yeah, I even saw him break out his smartphone trying to find something online. He didn't have it. So we actually have the advantage there because nobody's used the Henry Thiessen New Testament survey of New Testament introduction. Nobody's used that argumentation which was much more popular in the 1940s and earlier, where we can argue for earlier dates. So my Hijacking Historical Jesus, also the Fernandes Guide to Apologetic Methodologies, another book that I recommend. And I'm starting to republish some of my books in smaller booklet form. And so you can go to Amazon.com, just look up my name, Phil Fernandes, Fernandes with an S, and you could find the books there. So I'm not as well known as the other apologists, so it's unlikely to find it at bookstores, but Amazon.com's got them, and there's a few other places online that have them as well. So.
Cool.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Fernandes. Been a real pleasure catching up with you after all this time, and we're wishing you all the best.
God bless you guys. Love you guys. Keep doing what you're doing, and I'll be praying for Apologetics 315. You pray for my church and all, and our ministry and our families, and that'll be great. But great talking to you guys.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.
Hey, do you love a good story? Great. Then you got to check out the #Storytime podcast. Each episode brings you the craziest, creepiest, and cringiest stories from YouTube, TikTok, Reddit, and beyond.
My story is about the time that I was broken up with at the 9/11 memorial. Twice.
Look, the internet is a dumpster full of stories, and I, your host, Will McFadden, dive in headfirst, sift through the flaming trash, and bring you nothing but treasures. Listen to all 21 episodes of #Storytime now on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
You know what that is? It's someone buying a brand new car. A new car loses roughly 50% of its value in the first 3 years. That means 50% is money you're throwing down the garbage disposal. But if you buy a great used car with Shift.com, this is what it sounds like. And Shift brings the test drive to you. So be smart. Don't throw your money down the drain with a new car. Visit Shift.com and choose a super streamlined used car buying process.
Shift.com. Used cars never felt so new.